May 1481. In the scorching air of the Anatolian plain, inside a magnificent sultan's tent, where Persian rugs absorb the scent of leather, sweat, and rich incense, it is not a man who is dying, but an entire era. Mehmed II, Fatih, the Conqueror, lord of 2 lands and 2 seas, the man whose name made monarchs tremble from Venice to Persia, writhes on silk cushions in an agony unbefitting an epic hero. His body, hardened by dozens of campaigns and battles, is being devoured not by enemy steel, but by an internal, invisible fire. Court physicians, the best minds of their time, whisper in fear, their scholarly debates about indigestion and gout drowning in the realization of their own powerlessness. The great Sultan, whose gaze was said to move mountains and whose word could turn cities to dust, is now just helpless flesh, seized by fits of uncontrollable pain and vomiting. Outside the tent, the greatest army the world has ever seen stands in tense silence, ready at his signal to unleash itself upon the west or the east. The soldiers do not know that their master, their symbol of invincibility, is suffocating. His mind, which planned the conquest of the world, clouded by poison. This is the central, chilling paradox. The man who shattered the 1,000-year-old walls of Constantinople, a master of strategy, who challenged all of Christendom and held his scimitar over Rome itself, fell victim not to a great battle, but to a drop of poison, slipped into his food or medicine. His death is not the period at the end of a heroic poem, but an ellipsis, written by the hand of a traitor. How and why did the conqueror of the world, standing just a step away from his ultimate goal, find himself so utterly defenseless? It is this question that transforms his biography from a chronicle of victories into a tragedy about the nature of power, genius, and inevitable human vulnerability. To understand how the threads of fate wove this deadly knot, we must return to the world that spawned this titan, a world on the brink of fiery change in the mid-15th century. The geopolitical chessboard was a patchwork of dying empires and predatory young states. In the east, like an ancient sick lion, the Byzantine Empire was living out its last days. Once the ruler of half the world, it was now a shadow of its former greatness, shrunk to the size of its capital, Constantinople, and a few pathetic scraps of land in Greece. Its emperors, bearing the grand title of Basileus of the Romans, ruled over memories more than territories, desperately seeking help from a Catholic West that both despised them for their orthodox faith and feared losing the last bastion of Christianity in the East. This West, in turn, was fragmented. The Holy Roman Empire was more of an idea than a real power. The Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Florence, the Papal States, were busy with endless infighting, their wealth and culture existing alongside political short-sightedness. France and England were just emerging from the bloody haze of the 100 Years' War. And looming over this entire shaky world, like a thundercloud, was the Ottoman Empire. This was no longer just a horde of nomads, but a young, passionate, and incredibly organized military machine, a state army for which war was the meaning of existence and the main engine of the economy. The Ottomans had already crossed the straits, established themselves in the Balkans, and turned the once mighty Bulgaria and Serbia into their vassals. They were a force of nature, a relentless avalanche only gaining momentum. The world was frozen in a fragile balance, and to shatter it, only one man was needed, possessing enough will, genius, and ruthlessness to strike at the very heart of the old order. Into this boiling cauldron was born the future conqueror, Prince Mehmed, son of Sultan Murad II. He was not just an heir to the throne, He was the bearer of a heavy legacy, where greatness intertwined with cruelty and ambition with the constant fear of betrayal. From its very inception, the Ottoman dynasty was held together not only by the blood of its enemies, but also by the blood of brothers. The tradition of fratricide, which Mehmed would later codify into law, was not mere barbarism. It was a cruel necessity, a way to prevent the civil wars that had often pushed the empire to the brink of collapse. Every Ottoman prince knew from childhood, the throne was a game in which the winner took all, and the losers received a silk bowstring to the neck. This reality forged a character devoid of sentimentality. Mehmed grew up in the shadow of his father, Murad II, a distinguished ruler and general who, however, seemed weary of power and war. The relationship between father and son was complex, filled with unspoken rivalry. Murad twice tried to abdicate in favor of the young Mehmed and retire, and twice was forced to return to save the state from a crisis caused by his son's inexperience. These events, especially the first humiliating removal from the throne in his teens, left a deep scar on Mehmed's soul, giving rise to a burning desire to prove to the entire world, and primarily to his father's shadow, that he was not just worthy of power, but born for something immeasurably greater. It was not just a desire to rule, it was a need to surpass all his ancestors, to accomplish something that would forever write his name in the annals of history in golden letters. His ambitions were fueled not only by personal complexes, but also by a powerful ideological and mystical foundation. For centuries, a dream, almost a prophecy, had lived in the Islamic world. The conquest of Constantinople, the Red Apple, Kızıl Elma, as the Turks called it, a symbol of world dominion. It was believed that the Prophet Muhammad himself had foretold the fall of the great city, uttering the famous words, "Constantinople will surely be conquered. How wonderful is the leader who will conquer it, and how wonderful is the army that will conquer it." These words, passed down from generation to generation, transformed a military objective into a sacred mission, and the future conqueror into the chosen one of Allah. For the Ottoman sultans, who had already surrounded the city, this mission became a dynastic obsession. Dozens of times their ancestors had stormed the impregnable walls, but each time they retreated, broken by the power of the Theodosian walls, Greek fire, and Byzantine diplomacy. For Mehmed, this prophecy became a personal matter. He saw himself as that wonderful leader, destined by fate to finish the work begun centuries ago. This obsession was not just religious fanaticism, it was cold political calculation. Mehmed understood that as long as Constantinople, this dagger in the heart of the empire, remained independent, his state was vulnerable. The Byzantines constantly plotted, setting European crusaders against the Ottomans and supporting pretenders to the Sultan's throne. Taking the city solved all problems at once. It eliminated a centuries-old threat, united the Ottoman Asian and European territories, gave control over Black Sea trade, and most importantly, conferred indisputable legitimacy in the eyes of the entire world. The conqueror of Constantinople would become not just another sultan, but a figure of universal stature. To fulfill this destiny, more than a warrior was needed. A genius was required. And the forge of Mehmed's character worked non-stop from his earliest childhood. His education was phenomenal for the era. Contrary to the common image of a barbarian conqueror, he was a true Renaissance intellectual, albeit from the eastern side of the Bosphorus. He spoke 6 languages fluently, including Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and Serbian. He devoured the works of ancient historians, studying Ptolemy's geography and Archimedes' mechanics. But his true idol, his guiding star and eternal rival across the centuries, was Alexander the Great. Mehmed saw himself as his reincarnation, a new Iskander, destined to unite East and West under his rule. He carried Arrian's Anabasis with him, studying the tactics and logistics of the great Macedonian. This obsession with Alexander fueled his boundless ambitions and gave him a model to emulate. However, alongside this brilliant mind, an icy cruelty was also being forged in his soul. The lessons of court intrigue and the constant threat from potential rivals, including his own brothers, taught him to trust no one and to eliminate any threat without hesitation. Immediately after ascending the throne, legend says, he ordered his infant half-brother Ahmed to be drowned to secure his throne, a first step toward legalizing fratricide. He was a man of extremes. He could spend hours talking with Italian humanists and Byzantine scholars, and then order the mass execution of thousands of prisoners. This duality, this combination of the highest intellect and animalistic ruthlessness, made him the perfect instrument of fate, capable of shattering the old world. The key moment that turned the talented prince into an obsessed conqueror was his first, failed experience as ruler. In 1444, his father, Sultan Murad II, weary of wars and personal tragedy, decided to abdicate and hand over the reins of power to the 12-year-old Mehmed. It was an unprecedented move, one that the enemies of the Ottoman Empire saw as a sign of weakness. The Pope, breaking a solemnly sworn peace treaty, immediately organized a new crusade led by the King of Hungary. The Christian army invaded the Ottoman Balkans, and the young Sultan found himself facing a mortal threat. The state viziers, distrusting the boy ruler, panicked and begged Murad to return. Legend attributes a defiant letter to Mehmed, sent to his father. "If you are the Sultan, come and lead your armies. If I am the Sultan, I command you to come and lead my armies." Murad returned, crushed the Crusaders at the Battle of Varna, and although Mehmed formally remained in power for 2 more years, real control reverted to his father. In 1446, amid a revolt by the Janissaries, who were dissatisfied with the young ruler, Murad definitively returned to the throne, and Mehmed was sent into provincial exile as a governor. For the ambitious teenager, this was not just a political setback, it was a profound, personal humiliation. He tasted the bitterness of betrayal by his own elites and saw that the world does not respect weakness. He learned this lesson for life. The years spent away from the capital were not wasted. They became a time for accumulating knowledge, nurturing plans, and tempering his will. The rage born of humiliation transformed into cold, calculated determination. He swore to himself that when he returned to the throne, he would never again allow anyone, neither external enemies nor internal schemers, to doubt his power. And he would prove his strength by accomplishing what his father and all his ancestors had failed to do. He would take Constantinople. Behind all great conquests, behind the glitter of weapons and the roar of cannons, there is always one, all-consuming idea. For Mehmed, that idea, his secret obsession, his red apple that overshadowed all other goals, was the dream of Rome. Constantinople was only the first, though most important step on this path. Having taken the second Rome, he rightfully considered himself the heir of its emperors, a new Caesar. And the logical continuation of this legacy was the conquest of the first, Old Rome. He adopted the title Caesar-i Rum, Caesar of Rome, not as an empty phrase, but as a program of action. This Roman dream was the product of his unique education and historical vision. He did not see himself as just a Turkic sultan or an Islamic Ghazi. He thought in terms of world history, in the paradigm of Alexander and Caesar. He wanted to unite the entire former Roman Empire under his rule, to erase the border between East and West, creating a single, universal state with its capital in Constantinople, Istanbul. This ambition seemed like madness to his contemporaries, but to Mehmed, it was perfectly logical. He saw Catholic Europe as a collection of weak, perpetually quarreling states, incapable of fielding a unified force against his monolithic war machine. He looked down on the Pope, seeing him as merely a temporary usurper of power in a city that rightfully belonged to him, the new emperor. This obsession with Rome explains many of his subsequent actions: his persistent wars in Italy, his constant pressure on Venice, his interest in Italian artists and engineers. He didn't just want to plunder Rome. He wanted to make it part of his empire, perhaps even a second capital. And it was this grandiose, boundary-breaking dream which so elevated him that ultimately dug his grave. Europe, which could tolerate the loss of Constantinople, would never accept the loss of Rome. The threat to the Eternal City became the red line that united all his enemies against him, and perhaps even those in his own circle who were tired of endless war and the boundless ambitions of their master. When Sultan Murad II died in 1451, Mehmed ascended the throne for the second time. But this was no longer a frightened teenager. He was a 21-year-old man with an iron will and a gaze as cold as ice. The lesson of his past humiliation had been learned perfectly. His first act, as mentioned, was the elimination of his potential rival, his infant half-brother, which immediately demonstrated to the entire court that the era of compromise was over. He surrounded himself with new men, loyal only to him, and removed from power the old guard of viziers who had once contributed to his ouster. His energy was volcanic. He immediately began to implement his master plan. While the Byzantine emperor, Constantine V Palaiologos, naively believed he could manipulate the young sultan by threatening to release the Ottoman pretender Orhan, who was held in Constantinople, Mehmed was already busy preparing his army and navy. His calculation was ruthless and precise. He understood that to take a city that had withstood more than 20 sieges, something more than brute force was required. He needed perfect logistics, technological superiority, and a total blockade. He made peace treaties with his main European rivals, Hungary and Venice, to secure his rear, knowing full well that these treaties were just a temporary respite, a scrap of paper he would tear up as soon as he achieved his goal. He was a master of deception and political maneuver. He spoke of peace to European ambassadors, while ordering his engineers to build a fleet and cast cannons. The entire Ottoman Empire, from the Balkans to Anatolia, was transformed into a single military camp, working towards one goal. Mehmed personally controlled every aspect of the preparation, from harvesting timber for ships to developing new types of gunpowder. This obsession with detail would become the key to his future success. The key strategic move that demonstrated Mehmed's genius and unbending intent was the construction of the Rumelihisar fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, just a few miles from the walls of Constantinople. It was an act of unheard-of audacity, a direct violation of all previous treaties, and, in effect, a declaration of war. The Ottomans already controlled the Asian shore, where the Anadolu Hisar fortress stood, built by his great-grandfather. But building a second fortress directly opposite the first turned the Bosphorus into an Ottoman river. Mehmed had created a stone dagger pointed at the throat of Byzantium. Now, no ship could pass into or out of the Black Sea without his permission. This completely cut Constantinople off from its last colonies, and most importantly, from the grain supplies of the Black Sea region. The city was doomed to starvation. The construction was carried out at an incredible speed, dictated by the Sultan's personal will. Legend says he drew the fortress's plans himself and divided the work among his pashas, threatening execution for any delay. Thousands of masons, carpenters, and laborers worked day and night, and the gigantic fortress with its 3 massive towers rose in just 4 months in the spring of 1452. This was not just a fortification, it was a powerful psychological blow. The Byzantines and their Italian allies watched in horror from their city walls as the deadly trap closed around them. Emperor Constantine sent ambassadors with protests, but Mehmed answered them with icy contempt, stating that he had the right to build whatever he wished on his own land. When a Venetian ship tried to run the strait, ignoring the order to stop, it was sunk by a single volley from the new cannons installed in the fortress. The captain was beheaded, and his body was impaled. The message to the world was clear. The time for negotiations was over. The age of force had begun. But even a total blockade was not enough to shatter the legendary Theodosian walls, the triple ring of fortifications that had protected the city from all invaders for 1,000 years. Mehmed, a diligent student of history, knew this better than anyone. He needed a superweapon, a technological breakthrough that would turn the world's strongest walls into rubble. And he found it in the person of a mysterious Hungarian engineer named Orban. This man was an artillery genius, a master whose knowledge was ahead of his time. He had originally offered his services to the Byzantine emperor, but the emperor, in desperate financial straits, could not pay his asking price. It was one of history's fatal mistakes. Upon learning of this, Mehmed immediately invited Orban to his court, showered him with gold, and asked him only one question. "Can you cast a cannon capable of destroying the walls of Constantinople?" Orban, emboldened by unlimited funding and resources, answered yes. The result was a series of giant bombards, crowned by the famous basilica, a monstrous cannon about 27 feet long, capable of hurling stone cannonballs weighing over 1,200 pounds for up to a mile. Never before had the world seen anything like it. Transporting this monster from Adrianople to the walls of Constantinople was itself an epic operation, requiring hundreds of oxen and thousands of men. The sound of the basilica's firing was like the thunder of the apocalypse. Although the cannon was clumsy, required hours to reload, and eventually cracked under its own stress, it and Orban's other, smaller cannons played a decisive role in the siege. Day after day, they methodically reduced sections of the outer wall to ruins, instilling a sense of hopelessness in the city's defenders. The technological superiority, secured by Orban's genius and Mehmed's will, became the battering ram that breached the 1,000-year-old defenses. In early April 1453, a giant Ottoman army, numbering between 80,000 and 150,000 men by various estimates, encamped before the walls of Constantinople. Against this armada, Emperor Constantine could only muster about 7,000 soldiers, including about 2,000 Genoese and Venetian mercenaries. The disparity in numbers was catastrophic. The siege, which lasted 53 days, became a classic example of desperate courage versus overwhelming power, where engineering genius and psychological pressure played as great a role as brute force. Mehmed commanded the siege personally, demonstrating not only tactical skill, but also astonishing innovation. When the Byzantines blocked the entrance to the Golden Horn waterway with a massive chain, preventing the Ottoman fleet from approaching the more vulnerable seawalls, Mehmed executed one of the most daring maneuvers in military history. At night, he ordered about 70 of his ships to be dragged overland on greased wooden rollers across the hills of Galata, bypassing the chain entirely. In the morning, the city's defenders awoke in horror to see the enemy fleet in their inner harbor. This move not only created a new front of attack, but also dealt a crushing blow to the besieged's morale. In parallel, the relentless artillery bombardment, the mining of tunnels under the walls, and attempts to storm with siege towers continued. Mehmed used every tool available, turning the siege into a total war that exhausted the defenders' physical and spiritual strength. He preyed on their fears, offering to let them surrender on honorable terms, knowing they would refuse, which would then justify the subsequent slaughter. The final act of the drama unfolded on the night of May 29, 1453. After weeks of continuous bombardment, having worn down the defenders with constant small attacks, Mehmed ordered a general assault. The attack came in waves. First, the irregular troops, the Bashi Bazouks, were sent in. Their job was not to win, but to tire the defenders and absorb the brunt of the damage. Then, the regular Anatolian regiments moved into the breaches created by the artillery. The defenders, led by Emperor Constantine himself and the brave Genoese soldier Giovanni Giustiniani, fought with the fury of the doomed. It seemed they might repel this assault as well. But at the decisive moment, several fatal events occurred. Giustiniani was gravely wounded and carried from the wall, causing a panic among his men. Almost simultaneously, a small detachment of Janissaries discovered that a small, unguarded postern gate, the Kirka Porta, had been left unlocked by a fatal oversight. They slipped inside, raised the Ottoman banner on a tower, and this became the signal for the entire army. The defense collapsed. In the chaos of the battle, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine V Palaiologos, casting off his imperial regalia, threw himself into his final battle and died as a common soldier. His death symbolized the end of an era. The 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome, ceased to exist. Mehmed, entering the city on a white horse, rode directly to the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom. He dismounted, took a handful of earth, and sprinkled it over his turban as a sign of humility before Allah, who had granted him this great victory. He then entered the cathedral and ordered it to be immediately converted into a mosque. The eagle of the Second Rome had fallen, and on its ruins, a new empire was born. Having taken Constantinople, Mehmed immediately demonstrated that he was not just a destroyer, but a builder. Not just a barbarian conqueror, but a statesman with a long-term plan. At 21, he earned the nickname Fatih, the Conqueror, a title that would forever be attached to his name. But he craved more. He wanted to be the new Constantine, the city's second founder. For the first 3 days, as promised, the city was given over to the troops to be plundered, leading to untold suffering, slaughter, and the enslavement of tens of thousands. But after this period, Mehmed stopped the violence with an iron hand. He understood he needed a thriving capital for his new empire, not a smoldering ruin. He began a massive program of reconstruction and repopulation for the city he renamed Istanbul. He issued decrees guaranteeing the safety and property of residents who returned. He forcibly resettled thousands of families, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, from all corners of his empire, transforming Istanbul into a multi-ethnic and multi-religious metropolis. He appointed a new Orthodox patriarch, Gennadios Skolarios, granting the Greek community significant autonomy in their religious and civil affairs. This was not an act of mercy, but of pragmatism. He needed experienced Greek merchants, artisans, and bureaucrats to run his sprawling empire. He launched a grand building campaign. The Grand Bazaar rose on the site of the ruined forum. New mosques, baths, and caravanserais were built. And of course, construction began on the Topkapi Palace, which would become the administrative and political heart of the Ottoman state for centuries. By turning Constantinople into Istanbul, Mehmed didn't just capture a city. He appropriated its history, its imperial status, and its sacred meaning, declaring himself the rightful heir to the Roman Caesars. The conquest of Constantinople was just the beginning. Mehmed Fatih was obsessed with the idea of completely destroying the Byzantine legacy, so that no claimant would be left who could challenge his title of Caesar of Rome. After the fall of the capital, two fragments of the former empire still existed. Two independent Greek states ruled by members of the Paleologos dynasty. The first was the Despotate of Morea on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, ruled by the brothers of the fallen emperor, Thomas and Demetrios. These two, rather than uniting against the common threat, waged continuous civil war, even managing to ask the Ottomans for help against each other. Mehmed patiently watched their suicidal feud, and in 1460, when the moment was right, he invaded Morea with a huge army. The resistance was quickly broken. Demetrios surrendered and was sent into comfortable exile, while Thomas fled to Italy, taking with him the priceless relic, the head of St. Andrew, which he presented to the Pope. The other last bastion of Greek statehood was the Empire of Trebizond, hidden on the southeastern coast of the Black Sea. This state, founded by the Komnenos dynasty after the Fourth Crusade, was a rich trading center, but its isolation made it easy prey. In 1461, Mehmed moved his fleet and army on Trebizond. The last emperor of Trebizond, David Komnenos, seeing the hopelessness of resistance, surrendered the city without a fight in exchange for guarantees of his life and property. Mehmed did not keep his word. 2 years later, he ordered David and his entire family executed. With the fall of Trebizond, the last thread connecting the world to Byzantium was severed. Mehmed had methodically and ruthlessly cleared the chessboard of all pieces that wore the imperial purple. However, having finished with the Greek legacy, Mehmed faced new, equally stubborn opponents in the Balkans who refused to accept his rule. One of his most colorful and brutal enemies was the Wallachian prince Vlad III, better known to history by the nickname Dracula or Tepes, the Impaler. Vlad, who had spent several years in his youth as a hostage at the Ottoman court and knew Mehmed personally, was initially an Ottoman vassal. But after solidifying his power in Wallachia through a reign of unprecedented terror, he decided to challenge his former master. In 1462, he stopped paying tribute, crossed the Danube, and unleashed a bloody massacre in Ottoman territories, killing, by his own boastful accounts, over 20,000 Turks. In response, Mehmed gathered a massive army, the second largest after the one that took Constantinople, and personally led a punitive campaign into Wallachia. This campaign turned into a nightmare. Vlad the Impaler, realizing he could not win in open battle, unleashed a total guerrilla war. He poisoned wells, burned villages, and staged night raids and ambushes. The climax of this confrontation was the famous night attack, when Dracula, with a small detachment, burst into the Sultan's camp, attempting to kill Mehmed himself. Although the assassination attempt failed, it caused terrible panic in the Ottoman army. But the greatest psychological blow came when Mehmed approached his capital, Targovishte. Instead of a city, he found a gruesome forest of stakes, a field where the bodies of thousands of captured Turks and Bulgarians were left to rot. Even the battle-hardened Sultan, according to chroniclers, was shaken by the sight. Although Mehmed eventually succeeded in driving Vlad out and placing his more loyal brother on the Wallachian throne, the campaign showed that even his invincible army could be stopped by scorched earth tactics and limitless cruelty. If the confrontation with Dracula was a short but bloody episode, the war in the mountains of Albania became a true, unhealing wound for Mehmed, lasting nearly a quarter of a century. The reason for this was one man, George Kastrioti, known to history by his Turkish nickname, Skanderbeg. Like Vlad, Skanderbeg had been a hostage at the Ottoman court in his youth, converted to Islam, and had a brilliant military career in the Sultan's army under the name Iskender Bey. Mehmed knew him and valued his tactical genius. But in 1443, during a battle against the Hungarians, Skanderbeg betrayed the Sultan. He and his contingent of Albanians deserted the battlefield, returned to his homeland, renounced Islam, and raised a national rebellion against Ottoman rule. He proved to be a military genius, second only to Mehmed himself. Using his knowledge of the mountainous terrain and guerrilla tactics, he and his small army inflicted one humiliating defeat after another on the huge Ottoman armies sent to subdue him for 25 years. Mehmed twice personally led campaigns into Albania and besieged Skanderbeg's main fortress, Kruja, and both times he was forced to retreat with nothing. The impregnable Albanian mountains and Skanderbeg's genius turned the region into a Balkan Vietnam for the Ottoman Empire. For Mehmed, this was not just a military problem, but a personal insult. A man he had considered a comrade, his former subject, was publicly humiliating him, the conqueror of Constantinople. Skanderbeg became a symbol of Christian resistance, funded by the Pope, Naples, and Venice. Only after Skanderbeg's death from malaria in 1468 did the Albanian resistance begin to wane, and only 10 years after that did the Ottomans finally manage to completely conquer Albania. This grueling war cost the empire tens of thousands of lives and vast resources, demonstrating to Mehmed that the will of one man, multiplied by the support of his people, could become a barrier even to the most powerful military machine in the world. While Mehmed was expanding his empire's borders on land, he was challenged at sea by his most dangerous and sophisticated rival, the Republic of Venice. La Serenissima, as Venice was called, was not just a city, but a thalassocratic empire, its wealth and power built on total control of maritime trade in the eastern Mediterranean. The fall of Constantinople was a terrible blow to the Venetians, who lost their key trading posts and privileges. A clash between the two titans, the land empire of the Ottomans and the sea empire of Venice, was inevitable. The war, which lasted from 1463 to 1479, became one of the longest and most bitter of Mehmed's reign. It was a war for trade routes, islands, and coastal fortresses. The Venetian fleet dominated the sea, inflicting painful blows on the Ottomans, while on land, Ottoman armies slowly but surely conquered Venetian possessions in Greece and Albania. The key episode of this struggle was the heroic and tragic siege of Negroponte, the island of Euboea, in 1470. Mehmed personally commanded the siege, moving his army onto the island over a specially built pontoon bridge. After a brutal assault, the city fell, and the Sultan, enraged by the stubborn resistance, ordered a horrific massacre. Legend holds that the fortress commander, Paolo Erizzo, was sawn in half. The fall of Negroponte, considered the eyes and ears of Venice in the Aegean, was a shock to the Republic. The war exhausted both sides. Finally, in 1479, a peace treaty was signed. Venice ceded Negroponte and parts of Albania to the Ottomans and agreed to pay tribute, but it retained its trading privileges in Istanbul. This war taught Mehmed the importance of naval power, and he would invest enormous sums in developing his fleet for the rest of his life, understanding that without dominance at sea, his dream of conquering Italy would remain unachievable. While Mehmed was busy warring with Europeans in the West, a new power was rising in the East, threatening his hegemony in the Muslim world. This was the state of Akkoyunlu, White Sheep, a Turkoman tribal confederation that, under the charismatic and ambitious ruler Uzun Hasan, had united vast territories in eastern Anatolia, Iraq, and Iran. Uzun Hasan saw himself as Mehmed's main rival for leadership in the Islamic world, and actively formed alliances with the Sultan's European enemies, primarily Venice, promising to strike the Ottomans from the east. He considered himself a descendant of the great Turkic conquerors and had no intention of yielding to Mehmed. A clash between the two greatest Turkic rulers of their time was only a matter of time. The decisive battle took place on August 11, 1473, At Otluk-Beli in eastern Anatolia, Uzun Hasan's army consisted mainly of traditional Turkic light cavalry. Mehmed, however, brought a new type of army, which relied not only on the elite Janissary infantry, but also on field artillery and handheld firearms. The battle was a clear demonstration of the superiority of the new Ottoman military doctrine. When the Ak-Koyunlu cavalry charged, they were met with a murderous fire from cannons and guns. Suffering terrible losses, Uzun Hasan's army fled. The victory was total and unconditional. The power of Ak-Koyunlu was broken, and for the rest of his reign, Mehmed faced no serious rivals in the east. The Battle of Otluk-Beli was hugely significant. It not only secured Ottoman hegemony in Anatolia, but also demonstrated to the world that Mehmed's army was the most advanced and technologically equipped military force of its era, successfully combining the traditional discipline of the Janissaries with the latest firearms technology. Mehmed II was not only a brilliant general, but also an outstanding reformer who transformed the Ottoman state from a semi-feudal beylik into a centralized, bureaucratic empire. He understood that maintaining constant military expansion and managing vast territories required not only a strong army, but also an effective administrative apparatus and a stable economy. The foundation of his military power was the Janissary Corps, the elite infantry recruited through the devshirme system from Christian boys in the Balkans. Mehmed significantly increased their numbers and turned them into his personal guard, loyal only to him and not to the old Turkic aristocracy. He reorganized the entire army structure, created a powerful artillery corps, and actively implemented firearms. But his reforms were not limited to the military. He codified the laws, issuing 2 legal codes, Kanun name, that regulated all aspects of the empire, from the status of officials to taxation. He centralized the administration, making the Divan, the imperial council, led by the Grand Vizier, the main executive body. But he retained the absolute right to make the final decisions. He now preferred to appoint Grand Viziers, not from the noble Turkic families, but from his kul, his personal slaves, educated in the palace, which made them completely dependent on his will. He carried out financial reforms, standardized the tax system, and began minting a new, high-quality gold coin. In essence, Mehmed created the classic model of the Ottoman Empire, with the absolute power of the Sultan, a powerful central bureaucracy, and a professional army that would endure for centuries. However, the great reforms and endless wars required colossal resources, and Mehmed's methods for acquiring them caused growing discontent among all levels of society. The price of his imperial greatness was high, and everyone had to pay it. To finance his ambitious projects, he resorted to extremely unpopular measures. He confiscated vast amounts of land belonging to religious foundations, waqfs, and the old Turkic aristocracy, transferring them to the state treasury. This caused a quiet outrage among the Muslim clergy and the noble families, who were losing their sources of income and influence. He introduced new, heavy taxes and periodically resorted to debasing the currency, reducing the precious metal content, which led to inflation and hurt the pockets of commoners and merchants alike. Even his pride, the Janissaries, were unhappy with his attempts to cut their pay and limit their privileges. The old aristocracy watched with hatred as the Sultan elevated slaves from the devshirme system, giving them the highest offices of state. Among the people, he was seen as a cruel and greedy tyrant, and among the elites, a conviction grew that his endless wars were exhausting the country and leading it to ruin. This internal tension was hidden, but extremely dangerous. Mehmed, with his absolute power and network of spies, suppressed any open dissent, but he could not destroy the source of the discontent. He had created a powerful, centralized empire, but in doing so, he had made many secret enemies within it. These people may not have dared to challenge him openly, but they were biding their time. Many of them would likely have breathed a sigh of relief if his ambitious and costly reign were to suddenly come to an end. Adding to this internal tension were the traditional Ottoman court intrigues, centered on the harem and the struggle for succession. Although Mehmed tried to solve the problem of post-mortem civil wars with his law of fratricide, he could not eliminate the rivalry between his sons during his own lifetime. He had two main heirs, two princes, whose characters and ambitions were diametrically opposed. The elder, Bayezid, was the governor of Amasya. He was known for his piety, calm demeanor, and did not share his father's grandiose plans for world conquest. Bayezid was supported by the old Turkic aristocracy and the clergy, who saw him as a future ruler who could stop the endless wars and reverse Mehmed's unpopular reforms. He was the candidate of the peace party. The younger and favored son, Cem, was his complete opposite. He was a poet and an intellectual, but he possessed his father's energy, ambition, and martial spirit. Cem was a proponent of continuing the policy of conquest and was backed by the court's war hawk party and the officials who had risen through Fatih's reforms. Mehmed clearly favored Cem, seeing him as his true successor. This created an explosive situation. Factions and interest groups formed around each prince, plotting against one another. Bayezid and his supporters looked on in fear at Mehmed's grand plans to conquer Rome, understanding that a new, even larger war would lead to the country's final ruin and strengthen the position of their rivals. In such an atmosphere of mutual distrust and fear, the thought that the Sultan's premature death could be the solution to many problems for one of the factions does not seem so incredible. Bayezid had the strongest motive for wanting his father dead. It would not only save him from a potential struggle for the throne with his favored brother, but also give him the power to turn the empire's policy in a completely different direction. Amid this growing internal tension, Mehmed seemed to have reached the peak of his power, and perhaps had fallen into what the ancient Greeks called hubris, the pride that challenges the gods and fate. He considered himself invincible and his army unstoppable. But it was at this very moment that fate dealt him his first serious lesson. In 1480, Mehmed decided to eliminate the last major pocket of Christian resistance in the Aegean, the island of Rhodes, which was the stronghold of the Knights Hospitaller. These night pirates were inflicting serious damage on Ottoman trade and shipping, and their fortress was considered one of the most impregnable in the world. The Sultan sent a massive fleet and army to conquer the island under the command of one of his best generals. The siege was fierce. Ottoman artillery fired continuously, reducing the outer fortifications to ruins. The knights, led by the Grand Master Pierre d'Aubusson, defended themselves with desperate courage. After several weeks, the Ottomans launched a general assault. They managed to breach the city, and victory seemed close. But at the critical moment, the knights launched a desperate counterattack and drove the Janissaries from the breach, inflicting huge losses. The assault failed. Having suffered heavy casualties and facing supply problems, the Ottoman commander was forced to lift the siege and retreat in disgrace. For Mehmed, this was a stunning slap in the face. For the first time, his army had suffered such a clear and humiliating defeat. The failure at Rhodes showed that even his war machine wasn't all powerful. This wake-up call, however, did not cool his fervor. On the contrary, it only fueled his rage and desire to prove to the world that this was just a fluke. He immediately began preparing a new, even more grandiose campaign to wipe not only Rhodes from the face of the earth, but the very heart of the Christian world. The failure at Rhodes only spurred Mehmed on to realize his ultimate Roman dream. He understood that for a full-scale invasion of Italy, he needed a beachhead, a base on Italian soil. And in the summer of that same year, 1480, while the main army was occupied at Rhodes, he sent an expeditionary force under the command of Gedik Ahmed Pasha across the Adriatic Sea. Their target was the city of Otranto in Apulia, on the heel of Italy's boot. The city was captured after a short but bloody siege. The consequences were horrific. About 800 of the city's inhabitants, who refused to convert to Islam, were beheaded on a hill outside the city. They became known to history as the Martyrs of Otranto. The capture of Otranto had the effect of an exploding bomb in Italy and across all of Europe. For the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire, an enemy army had established a foothold on Italian soil. The panic was universal. Terror gripped Rome. Pope Sixtus IV prepared to flee the city, calling on all Christian rulers for a new crusade. The King of Naples, whose domains were in immediate danger, was in despair. It seemed Mehmed's dream was about to become reality. The Ottoman garrison in Otranto began launching raids deep into Italian territory, and everyone expected the Sultan to arrive with his main army the following spring to begin the march on Rome. The capture of Otranto was not just another military victory. It was the fatal act that overflowed the cup of patience for all of Mehmed's enemies. For Venice, it was a threat to its trade in the Adriatic. For the Pope, it was a mortal threat to the very existence of the Catholic Church. For European monarchs, it was an existential challenge. And perhaps for the Sultan's internal enemies in Istanbul, it was the final straw. Proof that his insane ambitions would lead to an eternal war that would consume the entire empire. It was at this moment, when Mehmed was so close to his goal, that the invisible gears of a conspiracy likely began to turn. In the spring of 1481, the Ottoman Empire was buzzing like a disturbed hive. Mehmed announced a new, great campaign. Troops from all provinces streamed to Istanbul and the Asian shore. An army was assembled that, according to some reports, reached 300,000 men, the largest force he had ever fielded. The entire world held its breath, trying to guess where this devastating blow would be aimed. Mehmed, as always, kept his plans a closely guarded secret, enjoying the fear and uncertainty he sowed among his enemies. There were three likely targets. The first was Rhodes. The Sultan thirsted for revenge for the previous year's humiliation. The second was the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, with whom Mehmed had a brewing conflict over control of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. But the most obvious and most terrifying target for Europe was Italy. The army in Otranto was awaiting reinforcements, and a march on Rome seemed the logical conclusion to his entire life. Venetian intelligence frantically tried to discover the Sultan's true intentions, their spies swarming all over Istanbul. The Pope desperately tried to cobble together a Christian league, but European monarchs, as usual, were busy with their own squabbles. The full weight of the coming storm seemed poised to fall on Italy. This atmosphere of universal fear and secrecy created the perfect conditions for a plot. When all eyes are fixed on the movement of massive armies, no one notices the quiet footsteps of an assassin in the halls of power. Mehmed, at the peak of his power, surrounded by an aura of invincibility, had likely lost his former caution. He was focused on the coming conquest, not suspecting that the greatest threat came not from the armies of the infidels, but from his own inner circle. On April 25, 1481, Mehmed the Conqueror, at the head of his grand army, crossed from Istanbul into Asia and made camp at a place called Hunkar Chayra, Sultan's Meadow, near Gebze, preparing to march. A few days after the march began, the Sultan suddenly fell ill. At first it was mild abdominal pain, which he, a sufferer of gout and rheumatism, probably dismissed as just another flare-up of his chronic ailments. But his condition rapidly worsened. Sharp colic, nausea and vomiting began. He was forced to stop and return to his tent. The best court physicians were immediately summoned. They began to argue about the diagnosis and treatment. The Sultan's chief physician was a Persian named Hamiduddin al-Lari. Other doctors, including a Jewish physician named Yaqub Pasha, a former Italian convert named Jacopo, offered their own remedies. But no medicine helped. The Titan's agony lasted for 3 days. The man whose will changed the map of the world lay helpless, his body convulsing, his mind clouded with pain. On May 3, 1481, at the age of 49, Mehmed II Fatih died in his campaign tent, never having revealed the final destination of his last campaign. His sudden and agonizing death in the middle of a military camp, surrounded by his own army, immediately gave rise to a wave of rumors and suspicion. The symptoms were all too similar to poisoning. The great conqueror, who could not be stopped by the walls of Constantinople, the armies of crusaders, or the fleet of Venice, had been halted on the path to his greatest goal. The question who hung in the air, and history may never provide a definitive answer. Immediately after the Sultan's death, the abscess of court intrigue burst open, which only strengthened the suspicion of a violent death. The Grand Vizier, a supporter of Shem, tried to conceal the Sultan's death to give his candidate time to reach the capital, but his plan was discovered by the Janissaries, who mutinied, killed the Vizier, and began looting the city, demanding Bayezid for the throne. Bayezid arrived quickly from Amasya and seized power. One of his first acts was to order the execution of his father's chief physician, Lari the Persian, which looked like an attempt to eliminate a key witness. So who was behind the possible poisoning? Several theories exist, each with its own logic. The first and most obvious is a Venetian conspiracy. Venice, more than anyone, feared an invasion of Italy and was a master of secret warfare, including the use of poison. Chronicles report that the Venetian Council of Ten repeatedly discussed plans to assassinate Mehmed. Perhaps they managed to bribe someone in his entourage, such as the physician Yaqub Pasha, who was a Venetian agent. The second theory is an internal plot, led by Bayezid's party. As mentioned, Bayezid and his supporters had the strongest motive. His father's death not only brought him to power, but also stopped a war that they believed was ruinous. The execution of the Persian physician could have been to eliminate the assassin, or it could have been an attempt to frame a foreigner. The third version combines the first two. The Venetians may have acted in alliance with Bayezid's supporters, finding common ground. Finally, one cannot discount the possibility of a natural death from his existing illnesses, perhaps exacerbated by incorrect treatment. However, the speed and nature of the symptoms make the poisoning theory the most likely. Perhaps he was given a slow-acting poison that aggravated his chronic ailments to a fatal level. The mystery of Mehmed's death remains unsolved, becoming the final paradox in a life full of them. Regardless of the cause of his death, Mehmed the Conqueror's legacy was colossal and complex. He took the Ottoman state as a strong but still regional power and left behind a world empire, stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates. He was the true founder of the Ottoman imperial system, which would last for more than 4 centuries. His conquest of Constantinople did not just destroy Byzantium, it forever changed the balance of power in the world, marking the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. The closing of the traditional trade routes to the east spurred Europeans to search for sea routes to India, which ultimately led to the Age of Discovery. For the Turkish people, he remains their greatest national hero, Fatih, a symbol of national pride and achievement. Bridges, districts, and universities are named in his honor. For the Muslim world, he is the great Ghazi, who fulfilled the prophecy and returned one of the world's greatest cities to Islam. For Europe and the Christian world, however, his image became synonymous with a cruel tyrant, the Antichrist, the destroyer of holy shrines. His name was used to frighten children, and the threat of the Turk at the gates became a constant factor in European politics. His legacy is twofold. He was a builder and a destroyer, a patron of the arts and a ruthless killer, a Renaissance man and a medieval despot. He built Istanbul as a cosmopolitan center of the world, but he did so on the bones of thousands of innocent victims. He laid the foundations of a mighty empire, but he soaked that foundation in blood and fear. It is this duality that makes his figure so tragic and compelling to history. And here we return to the central question and paradox of his life and death. How did the man who conquered the world die of poison on the way to his ultimate goal? The answer, as it so often is in history, is steeped in irony. Mehmed fell victim to his own greatness. It was precisely his most grandiose and audacious dream, the conquest of Rome, that catalyzed his demise. As long as he was fighting in the Balkans or Anatolia, his enemies could tolerate it. But when he raised his sword over the heart of Christendom, he crossed a line. The threat to Rome united everyone against him: the Pope, Venice, Naples. They were prepared to use any means to stop him, and poison was the cheapest and most effective. At the same time, his Roman obsession terrified his own elite. The peace party, led by Bayezid, saw that the Sultan was willing to sacrifice the entire empire for his personal, almost insane ambition. A new war with a united Europe could end in catastrophe. Thus, his greatest dream created a unique situation where his external and internal enemies found themselves in the same boat. Their interests converged on one point: the need to eliminate Mehmed himself. He had become too big, too dangerous, too unpredictable for the very world he had created. His indomitable energy, which had allowed him to take Constantinople, became his curse. He could not stop, and the world could no longer bear his momentum. The paradox is simple. A man who was like a force of nature could only be stopped by a betrayal born of the fear of that very force. His dream of Rome was so great that it generated the forces that killed the dreamer before he could make it a reality. In the end, the story of Mehmed the Conqueror is not just a tale of conquests and empires. It is an eternal parable about the nature of power, about the dizzying heights to which genius and will can elevate a man, and about the inevitable vulnerability that lurks at that summit. He was a man who believed he could reshape the world to his liking through force, that he could command history itself. He almost succeeded. But his story teaches us that the more grandiose one man's design, the stronger the resistance it provokes. Power is only absolute on the surface. In the shadow of the throne, plots are always woven, and the cup of wine may hold poison. The irony of fate is that Mehmed, perhaps the only man of his time who could have taken Rome, never reached it. His death saved Italy, and perhaps all of Western Europe. His successor, Bayezid, immediately withdrew the troops from Otranto and focused on internal affairs. The window of opportunity for the conquest of Rome slammed shut forever. The dream of a single universal empire uniting East and West died with him in that campaign tent. All that remains is the eternal question of what if that still excites the minds of historians. Fatih's story leaves us with a deep and unsettling reflection. Even the greatest conquerors, who move nations and shatter civilizations, ultimately remain hostages to human passions, both their own and those of others. And sometimes, the shortest path to ruin is paved by the greatest dream.